Kevin O'Regan was an emeritus senior research scientist at Université Paris Descartes and director of the Laboratoire Psychologique de la Perception, where he studied human perception in both babies and adults. An overarching theme of his works is the problem of perceived stability of the visual world. Our perception seems stable despite head movements, blinking, and saccadic eye motion. One of his most well-known contributions is on change blindness. He introduced the flicker paradigm, where you see an image, a blank screen, and then a modified version of the first image and try to spot the changes. And Kevin has worked on explaining change blindness and other perceptual phenomena in a coherent theory of human vision called the sensory motor theory. This is highly relevant to computer vision and to the themes of the workshop, partly because it disagrees with some of the main assumptions that we currently use when building generative models. So we're thrilled to have with us today, Kevin O'Regan.
Thank you very much for the wonderful introduction. So now let's see. Okay, so my talk is called The Visual World as an Outside Memory and the Sensory Motor Approach to Consciousness. Let me start with Hermann von Helmholtz, the great German mathematician, physicist, physiologist. He was one of the first persons to apply the methods of physics to study the human senses. And in his physiological optics, studying the eye and the vision, he was analyzing the construction of the eye. And he was appalled by all of its defects. And he said, if an optician wanted to sell me an instrument which had all these defects, I should think myself justified in blaming his carelessness in the strongest terms and giving him back the instrument. So in my talk, I want to show you some of these defects and describe how current day scientists think the brain overcomes them. So, oops, what's happening here? There we are, chromatic aberration. You know about chromatic aberration. It occurs when a lens is unable to focus different wavelengths of light at the same point. If your camera had chromatic aberration and you looked at a picture of the words red and blue printed in their respective colors, like on the right of this picture, you would get something like you see on the left. So the word red would be in focus and the word blue would be out of focus. Now, even the cheapest cameras today have composite lenses that cancel out chromatic aberration, so you get proper pictures. But what of the eye? The eye has atrocious chromatic aberration. There are 1.7 dioptries of difference in power between red and blue. 1.7 dioptries is a lot. An optician would not let you out of their office if you needed 1.7 dioptries of correction to your vision. So why don't we have the impression of seeing the world with fuzzy colors? Presumably, the brain compensates for this deficit in chromatic aberration. Now, something else. Rods and cones. The retina at the back of the eye that senses incoming light has two types of sensors, the rods and the cones. So during normal daylight, we see with the cones, but the cones are concentrated essentially in central vision, where our attention is. And as you see on the red line in this graph, which shows on the x-axis eccentricity, the cones are really only concentrated in the central 10 or 20 degrees of vision. Outside 10 to 20 degrees, there are virtually no cones. So we really don't see very well outside 10 degrees. Now the cones are also what delivers color vision. And without cones, you can't see colors very well. And this suggests that outside about 5 to 10 degrees from where you're looking, you just don't see colors. That's something rather surprising. You can test it for yourself using the following experiment. You get a friend to hold a couple of colored pencils in their hand, and she holds the pencils out in peripheral vision while you look at her nose. And then she brings the colored pencils in towards her ear while you keep looking at her nose. And you try to guess what colors the pencils are and what the orders of the pencils are, what the order of the colors is. And you will find that you're unable to do it. You might be able to get one or two of the colors, but you won't certainly be able to get the order in which the pencils are. And this is because color vision outside about 10 to 20 degrees is very, very bad. So why is it that we don't see the world as kind of becoming colorless when we move our eyes away from where we're fixating? Presumably, the brain has to compensate for this by somehow remembering the previous colors you saw where you were looking. And here's another egregious defect of vision. It's also related to the fact that, as we've seen, the retina samples the world in a non-uniform way with high density of cones in central vision. In this picture, at the top, I've represented the eye looking at a straight line up at the top. So that straight line projects as a great arc at the back of the eye. And the other line below it projects as a different great arc at the back of the eye. So if I flatten out the retina, as I've done down on the left, the stimulation of those two lines lies across the eye. The line that was on that you were focusing on directly lies on the equator, and so turns out to be straight. But the other line will be curved because it lay on a great arc, which was off the center. Furthermore, these lines are being sampled by the cones. Now, the cones are at the back of the eye. They are not uniformly distributed. They're high density at the center. So you see, I've represented these cones as the colored triangles, and you can see that at the center of the bottom straight line, they're densely packed. But then in peripheral vision, the packing falls off. So what is the cortical representation of these two lines? That's what I've represented on the right-hand side. Essentially, the line below is being sampled very densely in its middle, but less so at the ends. And the top line is being sampled very poorly. So in fact, the cortical representation of those two lines is just two blobs like that. They no longer look straight. They no longer are of equal thickness along their length. They're no longer of the same length. How is it that we see these two lines as being straight, of the same length, equally spaced, etc., despite the fact that the cortical representation has all these distortions? Presumably, you'd say, well, you need to have some kind of metric compensation mechanism that corrects for this in the brain. And then there's the blind spot. This is a photograph of my retina, taken with a laser scanning ophthalmoscope. So you can see the dark area in the middle. It's my fovea, where the light-sensitive cones are packed most densely and vision is clearest. Now the black spidery legs all over the place, that's the network of blood vessels that are spread over the anterior surface of the retina to irrigate it. Yes, the anterior surface. That means that the vessels irrigate the eye, irrigate the retina from the front, actually obscuring the light coming in. So why don't we see the world as though there were the body of a giant spider obscuring our vision? And worse, look over on the left. The spider legs come together here where there's a white region. The white region is the myelin of the nerve fibers coming from the retinal photoreceptors. And they all come together at this place called the optic disc and pass out of the eye along with the blood vessels that you see in black. They all pass out together in a bundle called the optic nerve. But of course, where they pass out, there can't be any photoreceptors. And we have what's called a blind spot. Now, everybody knows there's a blind spot in each of our eyes. But did you know how big this blind spot is in angular terms? It's between 5 and 8 degrees. That means it's big enough to engulf an orange held at arm's length. So you can check this. You've got to get the hands right. So you're going to use your right eye and your right hand to hold the orange. Okay, so you close your left eye and you look straight ahead of you and you hold an orange in peripheral vision and you gradually bring it in to where you're looking without looking at it. And at an eccentricity of about 12 degrees in the right periphery, the orange will disappear. Now you can start with a smaller object like your thumb to get the hang of it, but when you do it, you can figure out that actually an object as big as an orange can be engulfed in this way in the blind spot. So why is it that we don't see a big hole in our visual fields? Well, you could say maybe the other eye compensates for the hole in this eye. But even if you close the other eye, you don't see a kind of black hole in your vision. Why is this? what's going on? Now, if you look in the textbooks, they all say the brain fills in the blind spot. So this filling in process that the brain is supposed to do is seriously considered by neuroscientists who investigated in detail how this might happen. They've asked how intelligent the filling in process is. For example, these authors here have asked whether the filling in is some kind of interpolation from outside the blind spot, which they call associative filling in. That's the picture on the left. Or is it some kind of retinotopic ignoring that you would get if you kind of sewed up the hole in the cortical representation, as shown in the middle? Or is it some kind of intermediate solutions like shown on the right? And these authors here have a complicated neuronal model in which they try to explain the filling in of brightness in the blind spot. So the notion of filling in is the accepted interpretation of why we don't see a hole in the visual field due to the blind spot. Now, you might be getting tired of defects of vision and postulating different compensation mechanisms, but we're still not through, because perhaps the worst defect is yet to come, namely eye movements. You know, of course, that the eye spends most of the waking day flitting around making so-called eye saccades, that are movements rotating the eye up to 600 degrees per second, occurring about 4 to 5 times per second all day long. So what happens is that, say, at one moment, you're looking at one point on an image, like here, and you have this projected on your retina. You make one of these eye saccades, and so briefly, for about 20 milliseconds during the duration of the eye saccade, you have this on your retina before your eye comes to rest somewhere else on the image, and it's stable again. So during the saccade, the retinal image is smeared across the retina. The photoreceptors have nothing like the temporal resolution to be able to resolve the moving image. So essentially what you're seeing is this 20 millisecond smear. And it occurs 4 to 5 times per second all day long. Now, if I artificially projected a 20 millisecond smear on your eye, it would look just like a smear and you would see it perfectly well. So why do we not see these smears 4 to 5 times per second as we look around all day long? And worse still, consider this. At first, your eye was here with this on your retina. And then it was there with that on your retina. The image shifts. So why don't we see the world shift in that way? You can simulate the same kind of shift that actually happens by pressing on your eyeball. So if you close one eye and on the other eye, you put your finger on the side of your eye through your eyelid and you press firmly and suddenly against your eyeball, your eye moves and you see a shift in the retina, you see a shift in the visual world. Why don't we see similar shifts, much bigger shifts caused by eye movements when you move your eyes around 4 to 5 times a second all day long? To solve these problems, scientists in the last decades came up with the idea of what they call saccadic suppression. So the idea is essentially the idea of a faucet. Since the brain knows when the saccade occurs, the information coming in from the retina can be switched off briefly during the saccade. And then they use the idea of the extraretinal signal. It's a signal coming from the brain that tells the brain by how much the eye has moved at any instant. The idea is that this signal could then be used to compensate for the image shifts. So to understand, consider the top picture here. Imagine at this moment, the eye is looking at the window in the picture, in the real scene. So what the brain does is to insert the information about the window into a kind of internal screen that it has constructed concerning the outside world. And I've represented that in the lower part of the picture, where I have a kind of internal projector that's projected the information about the window at one point in the internal screen. So then when the eye moves, let's say to the tree over on the right in the top part of the picture, then the information about the tree is inserted in the appropriate place in the internal screen below. So the extraretinal signal tells the internal projector by how much it should shift the information so that gradually a composite image is built up of the outside world into this internal screen. So in that way, through successive eye movements, a patchwork picture of the outside world is built up. And the idea then is, what seeing is not seeing the instantaneous snapshots you get on your retina as you look around, but seeing consists in exploring rather or activating an internal representation of the outside world, like this internal screen. And so what we see is a whole perfected, stable world. So it seems like a very nice idea. When I was doing my PhD, I thought this was great, and I wanted to check it out with some predictions that the idea would make. So I set up the following experiment. I had an observer looking at a computer screen. The observer was wearing a pair of glasses that measured their eye movements. And the glasses were connected to a computer, and the computer could control what appeared on the screen. So at first, the observer would look at a point on the left of the screen, and have the computer put up a set of random lines on the screen. And then when the observer moved their eyes to a point on the right-hand side of the screen, I would change the random lines and set up a set of other random lines. However, I did this in such a way that if you superimposed the two sets of random lines, they formed a word. Except at no moment did the word ever appear completely on the screen. Either the observer was looking at one side or on the other side, but so at no moment on his retina was the word visible. However, if there is an extraretinal signal, and if there is an internal screen which is building up a patchwork of information coming from the retina in the way I suggested a minute ago, this internal representation should contain the composite word. But unfortunately, this never happened. Many observers did my experiment, and I was never able to demonstrate their ability to see the whole word. And over the years, other experiments were done to test this notion of extraretinal signal and this notion of internal screen. And there was a clinching experiment done in 1996 by McConkie. George McConkie had observers looking at pictures, detailed, colorful pictures on a computer screen. And he linked up the eye movement measuring device to the computer. And every time the observer made an eye movement, he would change something in the picture like this. And the things he changed could be big things, totally obvious things. And yet people very rarely saw these changes. It was an amazing result. People were very, very surprised. So it really seemed that something was wrong with the notion of extraretinal signal, and something was wrong with the notion of internal screen. So this made me think. This is me holding a cup. I feel the cup in my hand. It's a whole cup. I feel, with my eyes closed, that the cup is complete. There are no holes in the cup. It's smooth all over. I know there's a handle. I can feel the handle. And yet, look, between my fingers, there are gaps. There are blind spots between my fingers. Do you think that I should postulate a filling in mechanism from my touch sense that fills in the touch between my fingers so that I don't think that there are holes in the cup? Do you think that because the tips of my fingers have high sensitivity, whereas the palm of my hand has low sensitivity, I have to postulate a compensation mechanism that compensates for this difference in sensitivity so that I don't think that the cup is less smooth where I'm touching it with the palm of my hand? Do you think that when I briefly remove a finger from the cup, that I think that that part of the cup has suddenly disappeared from my touch sensation? I think most people think that when you're thinking about touch, the need to postulate compensation mechanisms for the defects in my touch sensor seems ridiculous. Why is that? Why is it that for touch, we don't think we need such compensation mechanisms? I think the reason is that we conceive of touch as an exploratory modality. Touching is an exploratory skill. When we touch things, we use a tool, namely our hand, to explore the outside world, which we consider to be outside of us. The feeling that we're currently touching a whole, perfect, stationary cup with no holes, no imperfections, comes not from the fact that we've activated a little internal model of the cup in our minds, but through the fact that every aspect of the cup is immediately accessible in the outside world through a simple movement of my fingers to test what's there. All the aspects of the cup are available to my instantaneous exploratory activity. So in conclusion, the feeling I have of touching an object comes from the feeling of wholeness and perfection comes from the immediate accessibility through exploration, not through activation of some internal representation of the cup. So my idea would be that we should consider vision in the same way. Just like for touch, we should consider that vision is using the retina like a giant hand that we use to explore the outside world. This idea was already suggested by the cybernetician Donald Mackay in 1962. So there's no internal picture of the outside world that we have to create. All we have is ongoing exploration of the eye through our attention movements and eye movements. So just like for touch, there's no need for filling in the gaps in our retina. There's no need to compensate for the distortions and the defects. There's no need to compensate for eye movements. The apparent richness, completeness, continuity of the world, of the visual world, derives from the immediate accessibility at any moment to the slightest shift of attention and of my eye movements. So why do I have the impression of seeing everything perfect in front of me, if in fact, in order to see things, I have to move my eyes? So I consider it's like the light in the refrigerator. So I open the door of the refrigerator, the light is on. I close the door of the refrigerator. I wonder, is the light still on? I sneakily, quickly open the door. Yes, the light is on. Every time I look, the light is on. So it gives me the impression that the light is on continually. In the same way, as we look around us, we have the impression that the visual world is continuously visible to us in all its splendor, in all its richness, like a picture postcard. Whereas in fact, at any moment, we're really only exploring one small aspect at a time. The impression of seeing continuously and seeing everything and seeing it without imperfections derives not from the activation of an internal picture that is perfect and stable, but from the immediate accessibility of any detail through a flick of the eye or of attention. Now, this view of what seeing is not just a philosophical idea. It actually makes concrete predictions that can be verified experimentally. One thing is that it says that in a certain sense, you're seeing less than you think you're seeing. It's because you can only be paying attention to a small amount of stuff, and the rest is somehow just latent. This shows the importance of attention in seeing. Now, attention is something that's known in experimental psychology, and psychologists have spent a long time studying attention. So this is a task where you are being tested for your attentional skills. You have to follow this coin around as it's being moved around by all these hands. And your task is to concentrate and to tell me where at the end the coin is going to turn up. So where is the coin? There it is. Did you get it right? However, many people looking at this video when I give it in classes do not notice the fact that actually there is a green pepper that appeared in the middle of the video, right in front of your eyes. I'm doing the video again here. Because you were paying attention to where the coin was, you didn't see the green pepper that crossed your visual field right in the middle. So the green pepper is going to appear pretty soon now and cross the visual field. There's the green pepper. So about 50% of people in a classroom demonstration will not see the green pepper. Now, many of you have seen the famous gorilla demonstration where you don't see a gorilla going across the screen in the middle of the demonstration. But I couldn't do that because you knew about the gorilla. So I made this demonstration to show you the phenomenon which is called inattentional blindness and which has a big literature in psychology. So that's one of the predictions made by the idea that actually we don't see everything and that you can trick your sensation of seeing by this kind of manipulation. Now, another question you can ask about seeing is, if I'm right that seeing is not activating an internal representation of the world, but rather is a process of continually exploring the outside world, then there's obviously a role for your knowledge, your prior knowledge about the world and your memory. So why is seeing different from remembering or just thinking? I need to explain what it is about seeing that makes it seem real to us and different from just thinking, just having information. And I have, in my sensory motor theory about vision and consciousness, I have several criteria or several aspects of what it is to see, which explain why seeing seems real to us rather than being like thinking or remembering. And one of them is what I call bodyliness. I don't want to talk about it right now, but I want to talk about another one, which I call grabbiness. Now, grabbiness is something about sensory systems which describes all sensory systems. It's the fact that when there's a sudden event in the outside world, like a sudden noise or a sudden flash of light or a sudden punch in the stomach, this incontrovertibly grabs your attention. And sensory systems are built in such a way that sudden events of this kind incontrovertibly attract your attention, okay? So what this means is, for example, if you're looking at a picture and there's a sudden event in the picture, like this, immediately your attention is directed to the change in the picture, and so you immediately become aware that there has been this change. And so this gives you the impression that you're seeing all aspects of the picture, because if any aspect of the picture should change, the grabbiness will cause your attention to go to that element and signal to you that there has been a change. And so you have the illusion that even though, in fact, your attention is not continuously on everything in the picture, that you are potentially able to detect anything that changes. So you think you're seeing everything, but in fact, you're not seeing everything. You're only seeing what you're currently attending to at this moment. So to show that, what I did is I inserted a bright flash in the picture. So here's a picture.
Kevin, you've got 5 minutes left.
I inserted a bright flash between the first picture and the changed picture. So, and I made a change in the picture during the flash. Now the flash causes the transient detector to get confused because there are transients all over the picture. So your attention doesn't know where to go, and you can't see the location where the change occurred. So here, I'll do it again. Many people, when looking at this picture, will just not notice the enormous change that occurs every time they make the flash. because the transients that would normally attract your attention are washed out by the white flash. So if you want to know what the change is, you look at the man's nose. If you're looking at the man's nose, you're within a few pixels of the change. But again, many people, even though their eye is right on the change, right near the man's nose, you may still not see the change. The change is the bar in the background that's going up and down. It's an enormous change. You don't see it. And yet you have the impression that you can see the whole picture. And that's a kind of illusion. It's an illusion derived from the immediate accessibility through your eye movements and through attention of any aspect of the picture that you happen to be interested in. Here's another example. So here's a change. It's a big change. Many people will not notice that there's a mountain in the background behind the girl's head that's appearing and disappearing. And here's another way of making the changes. In here, I put what I call mud splashes on the picture. So those mud splashes occurred. They were actually spread around the picture. The change that occurred was perfectly visible behind the mud splashes. The mud splashes were not hiding the change, and yet you don't see it. I'll do it again. Many people will not notice that the dotted line in the road is changing. So that's another example of this phenomenon called change blindness, which is a prediction, essentially, of this apparently philosophical idea about what seeing really consists of. Here's another way of making changes. So in this picture, a change is occurring, but the change is occurring so slowly that it doesn't, let's make sure that the change really is occurring here. Yeah, it was occurring, except I couldn't see it myself. Start again. Okay, the change is occurring, except the change is occurring so slowly that it doesn't excite the transient detectors in your visual system. And so you just don't see it. And the change, I can't see the change actually. Maybe this isn't working properly. Yeah, maybe it wasn't working. Okay, now it's working. So the change is enormous. It occupies about 1/3 of the whole picture. And then you probably won't see it. Usually in a class, this is one, people really in a classroom demo, most people just never see the change until I tell them what it is, despite the fact the change is absolutely enormous, right? So the change is about finished now. So the change is the color of the ground of the merry-go-round. I'll show you the original color. It was red, like that. So you just didn't see that. 1/3 of the picture probably didn't notice it. Okay, so that kind of concludes what I wanted to say. I wanted to say that this approach to what seeing, what vision really is, which I call the sensory motor approach, is a philosophical idea which makes predictions like change blindness. There's other predictions it makes, which I haven't had time to talk about color adaptation, sensory substitution. And I used that idea also in my book, which is called Why Red Doesn't Sound Like a Bell. And it's a book about the field of consciousness, which you can read. And I used this also in theory about how the notion of space can occur in humans. You can download my book on my website there and see demos. So I'm finished. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kevin, for the wonderful talk. Again, for audience, if you have questions, you can please raise your hands or just type them in QA. In the meantime, I actually had one question, which was, so the idea that we can continuously see and explore is very valid when we are sort of, there experiencing the world. But if you're seeing, let's say, just a static image, then, because it's a static image, you can't actively explore or move around, but you still maybe can think of things hidden behind furniture or the wall. And does that to some degree speak to the fact that we may still have some sort of mental models, even though we may not necessarily rely on them as much if we are there in the real world?
I'm not sure I completely understood your question, but
Right.
see, it all depends what you mean by a mental model. Most people think of vision as creating a mental model, which is something like a picture postcard, okay? And what my theory essentially is saying is that the mental model is nothing like a postcard. It doesn't contain pixels. It doesn't contain high resolution details about the picture. It's of a much more abstract nature. It's sort of more like abstract knowledge. It's knowledge saying things like, yes, there is an apple over there. And behind the apple, currently there is, let's say, a glass. Even though I can't see it at this moment, I know that there's a glass. But the apple, even the color of the apple and its exact size and the pattern of color on the apple, these are all things that are probably not even stored in my mind, because I can use the outside world as a memory, as an external memory store that I can access. Why bother to re-represent the color of that particular area of the apple in my mind when I can just access it by quickly moving my eye there or my attention there? But so I do have some kind of mental information or knowledge about the apple. I have knowledge about the approximate location of the apple and the room, but it's not of a metric nature. It's not like a picture. It's not like a little model, and it doesn't have high detailed information.
Okay, thanks. Actually, we have a couple more questions. One from Jonas. I think, Jonas, you're unmuted, so you can ask your question.
Okay, great. Hi. So I'm just wondering, that goes maybe a little bit into the same direction as the earlier question. Like, what about, so number one, dreams, where you're very convinced that you kind of actually see something, and then also like very sort of accurate visual images. Like I'm sitting in my office, but I can perfectly well picture myself in my kitchen, and you see all the visual details and see colors and reflections, materials, and so on. So I'm just wondering, how would that fit into this theory?
Well, it's the same. I would say that, in fact, kind of most people think that dreaming is a kind of impoverished version of seeing. But what I'm saying is that in order to seem like normal seeing, dreaming has to have the same degree of richness as normal seeing has. Now, if I'm saying that normal seeing actually is not rich at all, it's very impoverished, that means that in order to seem like normal seeing, dreaming has to be very impoverished. It can be very impoverished. The reason that I think I'm seeing a world with wonderful richness and detail at any moment is because if I want to know whether this pixel is red or green, I look at it and I think about it, okay? I don't actually see it at any moment. So similarly, in dreaming, if you tell me I can imagine my kitchen in the greatest amount of detail, I would claim that what this really means is that if you think about the color of your toaster, okay, at this moment, then you say to yourself, yes, well, it's red and white. And then it becomes apparent to you that you're seeing it as red and white, and it appears red and white. But then if at that moment somebody asks you, well, is there actually behind the toaster a picture of a dog? You'll say, oh, well, then you ask yourself, well, is there a picture of a dog? And then you say, yes, well, there is. But actually, when you were thinking about the color of the toaster, you were not aware of the picture of the dog. You're kind of building it up at every moment as you go along. The fact that you have the impression of seeing everything simultaneously is an illusion that you create, like the light in the refrigerator.
Thanks.
Thanks. We have one last question from Katrina, and then we'll switch to the next speaker.
Yes, hi, thank you for the great talk. Yeah, that makes sense. So they're not all available at the same time. I think this is what you're trying to say, right? But actually at the part of the top where you showed your cup and your fingers and said, okay, now my finger goes away from the cup. Do I need to paint to imagine that the cup is still there? I would imagine that, yes, you do. It's exactly what you're saying, that if you move back your finger, you do expect the cup to be there. You do all sorts of predictions. You know that your finger will stop at the cup and so on. How do you make those predictions? There needs to be some internal model, right? And also, that's one thing. And the second is, so basically, whether it's everything available at the same time or not, does not cancel the idea of an internal model. And this thing that you said about exploration, when I go in a new environment or I see a new object, I do explore more, right? I see more, I touch more, but for my keys, I just touch one point and I know, okay, that's my keys. I even know the pose because I'm just so familiar. I fill in the details by imagination, for example. But basically all the questions you asked about the touch, I was answering inside me, yes, yes. And then you said, oh no, you wouldn't expect that. I would say, yeah, sure. We can totally imagine and in-paint the touch, signal exactly the same way we can in-paint the vision signal, let's say. Yeah, I don't know what's your opinion.
I'm sorry, your sound was a bit cut off and I wasn't able to completely understand everything you said. It seems to me though that you are saying the same thing as Shubham said in his first question, which was, surely there is some kind of internal model. And I agree, there is some kind of internal model, but it's not a model with metric qualities. It doesn't have to be, doesn't have to have metric qualities, because whenever you want to know about the metric aspects or the particular positions of pixels, then you can just refer to the outside world to get the information. If you do experiments like the ones that I've been doing on vision and other people have been doing on vision, it turns out that your metric knowledge, when you close your eyes, the metric knowledge you have about the world is extremely poor, extremely poor.
That's right. But this internal model should answer the fact that, oh, if I move my finger, will I hit the cup or not?
But it's very, yes, but it's very approximate. It doesn't say by how much you have to move your finger.
Right.
And you can completely trick it. You can make incredible, like I did one experiment, for example, which I didn't show you, where I had people reading. So they would read along the lines of text that appeared on the computer screen, okay? But the computer, every time they moved their eyes through a certain number of letters across the text, I would shift the text by about half as many letters in the other direction, okay? So as they moved their eyes, the whole text was moving backwards. And so they were essentially reading twice as fast as they would normally do, because their eye would make saccades that were twice as big as the ones that they really thought they were making. And nobody would notice it. They would come out of the experiment saying, that's funny, I read really quickly today.
Right.
And McConkey's experiments really show you can make enormous changes during your viewing of a detailed picture, and people simply do not notice it.
Great. Yeah, thank you very much. That answers my question.
Okay. Thanks a lot for the talk and joining us here.
Thank you.